Thank you, President, and thank you, everybody. And it's a real pleasure to be here at the conference today. But in introducing me, the President said he had a simple question, but my response is that I don't think there's really a simple answer, because in a way, the developing countries, they're everything that's left. We know the OECD, but when we think about developing countries, perhaps we have an idea of what they are, but then when we come to specifics, we'll see that they're located in many parts of the world. They have vastly different cultures and habits of consuming as well, when we look at the differences between them. As you can see here, I work for FAO, La FAO, per quelli che la conoscono. And we have our beautiful palazzo a Roma. It's a real pleasure to be accommodated in Italy by the Italian state. I won't mention how much we pay in rent, but you'd be surprised if I told you, I think. It's very little. So before I start my presentation, I'd like to mention World Milk Day. I'd like to mention World Milk Day. This is a celebration that FAO began 14 years ago. And basically, we choose one day a year to celebrate milk and the milk industry. And I'd encourage all of you who are here, who work in the industry, to think about promoting the industry by celebrating this day. In fact, this morning when I opened my email, I had a message from our office in Santiago, in Chile. And they wanted to know, because countries were contacting them, who was celebrating World Milk Day and what it meant. And in fact, in the world, we have approximately 50 countries that are celebrating, spread throughout the globe. Even in Europe, there are many. For example, there's Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Germany, France, Spain, Croatia, Austria. In the past, I think Italy is also celebrated, but only on the level of the regions. Now, as again, I mentioned turning to the developing countries. They cover a wide range of different types of countries, but I'd like to begin my presentation with talking about the general characteristics. I'd like to begin my presentation by talking about the general characteristics of these countries. First of all, they have a very young population. And what this means is that there's going to be a sharp increase in population over the coming decade. For example, over the next 10 years, the population, mainly in these countries, is going to increase by nearly 700 million people. And the greatest increase will be in Africa and in Asia. The second fact that I'd like to signal that they have in common is that within these countries there's rising income, and with rising income it means there's also rising demand. Within any particular country there'll always be a middle class, which is interested in consuming higher value and perhaps imported products. For example, the middle class in India is probably much bigger than the whole of the population from Italy, I should imagine. The other thing that is changing in these countries is the things that they consume, and the traditional products is changing. In many cases, they have fewer children, and in this case, the parents will give more attention to what the children eat and what they're fed on. And often dairy products are seen as an important element in ensuring healthy growth. Another important element is that the population of the world is moving into cities. It's moving into cities at a rate that it's difficult for us to understand, I think, looking from Europe. This is in fact a picture of South Africa, of Cape Town. And in the last 10 years, the population has grown by 30%. So you can imagine if you live whatever country or city you care to think about. I live in Rome. Perhaps the population is 5 million. And if you can imagine, in the course of 10 years, that 5 million suddenly became 7 million. And the next 10 years, perhaps it would become 10 million, and so on. So when we look at these factors overall, what do they mean for dairy products and the demand for dairy products? There are more people, more young people, more emphasis on feeding children well, because there are fewer children per household. People are living in cities, so they have access to electricity. And basically, it means that people are consuming more dairy products as part of their diets. Now, when we turn to world milk production, you can see in this graph it shows the increase in world milk production. In blue, we have the developing countries. In yellow, we have the developed countries. And the purple line at the bottom shows the trend of the developing countries against the trend in the developed countries. And you can see quite clearly from this that, in fact, milk production in the developing countries has now exceeded that in the developed. And the lines are never going to come back together. The main future production in the world of milk will be in the developing countries. If I give you some current figures, at the moment, 2014, we estimate about 400 million tons of milk are produced in the developing countries, as against 383 million tons of milk in the developed countries. Turning now to production, what we see here in blue is current production. In yellow is current production, and in blue is projected production in 10 years' time, approximately in 2021. You can see here that some countries are expected to increase significantly, while others will remain stable. Perhaps the most interesting country we show on the graph is India. It's already the world's largest milk-producing country, but it's soon, or within 10 years, it's set to overtake the European Union as a whole, that is, all the 28 EU member states in terms of its milk production. We could look at New Zealand. Perhaps people are surprised to see how small it is in terms of a milk producer. Of course, New Zealand will increase its milk production, but when we look, for example, at India and the amount that will increase, or even the USA, or again China, it's really not by a large proportion. When we look at the world market, this means that there's perhaps potential for other countries to become more important exporters, such as Argentina and a range of other countries, and also the USA, as we saw. Now, looking at trade, it's important to remember that in terms of world milk production, only about 8% is actually traded. That means that over 90% of milk is consumed in the country where it's produced. And not only is it only consumed in the country where it's produced, but it's probably consumed in the village or the small town where it's produced as well. Now, this has important implications when we consider the world market, and especially those for developing countries, where predominantly people drink fresh milk and consume fresh dairy products, often of their own production or from the local village where they live. Now, once upon a time, this is how we saw the export market, especially in Europe, but also in North America. It was seen as a way of reducing stocks. There was too much milk being produced, and there was the whole program, as we know, under the CAP, to provide incentives for export. This used up a lot of public funds, and in the end, it was shown to be quite unsustainable. When we look at this package, the first thing that strikes me anyway is that it's very anonymous. We see skim milk powder. Where does it come from? Who produced it? What does it contain? But the system was guaranteed in that if companies stole into the EU storage stocks, they got a margin on their production. They made 6%, 8%, and they were very happy with that. But I think in Europe especially, it made people lazy, that they didn't want to develop products that the market really wanted. They were quite happy to sell into intervention because it supplied a secure base for their market. Now, with the decline of those sort of sales, what we've seen is that countries are developing products, first of all, that carry their brand name. Here we have Conaprole from Uruguay. And secondly, the products have become highly specific. But they no longer export just one sort of powder or one type of butter, but they look at the different markets and also the different subsectors within that market to see what is needed. This also applies to butter and cheese. Obviously, when we talk about exports, the majority of any product is still exported in bulk and then repackaged. But as we move towards a more flexible market, it creates a lot of opportunities for product differentiation, for better quality control, and also for branding and promotion. This rather complicated graph shows the growth in trade of dairy products, leaving from the base of around 2010 and going to 2021. As you can see, in terms of volume or tons, cheese, which is the second category, is the most widely traded. But if we add the second and fourth category together, which are skim milk powder and whole milk powder, we can say, as a group, it's really milk powder, which is the most important commodity that is traded on the world market. And there are obvious reasons for this, that if milk is over 90% liquid, it's not economic to ship the water around the world. It makes much more sense to ship the powder and add the water and other ingredients when you get there. The various colors here, perhaps I'll just mention that because it's not so clear. We have green Argentina, red Australia, blue the EU, purple New Zealand, yellow the USA, and red the rest of the world. You can see here we have New Zealand in purple. You can see the predominance of New Zealand as an exporter of butter within the world market, both now and we expect it to remain that way in the future. But also the USA and Argentina are becoming much more important in the market. But we have to remember that when we talk about trade, I come back to this point, that the trade is really supplying the processing industry. It's not a reflection of what the consumption is in these countries, which is mainly fresh products. As we're in the EU, I thought I'd include this graph. It shows EU exports of dairy products beginning in 1981, passing through the present day. We begin with EU 15, and we go to EU 27. In yellow, we have butter exports. In blue, we have cheese, green, SMP, and red, WMP. You can see, because of the decline in the subsidy, there's been a substantial decline in exports. And I know the earlier speaker said that it may increase, and perhaps it might. But at least the trend for the moment is for it to best be stable or perhaps even decline a bit further. Now, if you thought the first graph was complicated, or the first bar chart, this is even more because it's showing the importers. If I might just go back a second. You can see the exporters are really, there aren't very many countries. The rest of the world, in most cases, is only around 10, 15, 20%. But when we come to the importing countries, it's much more complicated in terms of who imports what, which are the most important, and so on. And in fact, many of the developed countries are also important importers. For example, we have the US in green, Russia is in a browny color. We then have Algeria in white, China in light blue, Japan in yellow, Mexico in red, and Saudi Arabia in purple. So these are the principal importing countries. There are many more, but you can see it's a much more mixed bag. For example, there you can see the importance of Russia as a market for butter and also for cheese. Whereas China has become an extremely important market for the powders. This, in fact, shows Chinese imports from 2005 to an estimate for 2014. And you can see there from 2000, in terms of milk equivalent, and you can see there from 2008, the imports have shot up. And really, we put 2014 as a slight decline in the curve. But the only reason we've done that is that we can't really think where the milk will come from, because China is drawing in so much milk and product. But then, as we saw earlier from the production, it's hard to imagine exactly where this milk can be drawn from, because it's not that easy to increase milk production very quickly. So turning to consumption, this shows current consumption for the various products. We have butter, cheese, skim milk powder, and whole milk powder. And in yellow, we have the developing countries, and in blue, the developed. So you can see quite clearly that in terms of butter and the powders, the developing countries consume more, and the developed countries are the biggest consumers of cheese. Now, looking at the left side of this graph, it shows per capita consumption of whole milk powder. And on the right side, we have per capita consumption of cheese. In brown, we have the expected per capita consumption in 2021. And in black, we have the current consumption. I mean, as we know, we live in Europe. Europe doesn't consume much whole milk powder. Most of it is in the processing industry. On the other hand, it consumes a lot of cheese, and excellent cheese at that. But then if we look at some of the other countries, like Brazil, we can see that per capita consumption of powder is actually higher than cheese. And if we go to Algeria, you can see it's much, much higher. That's the country at the bottom, than in the case of cheese. So considering now the situation in 2020, 2021, this gives the expected levels of per capita consumption for the different regions of the world I'm talking about the yellow bar to begin with. So we have still the highest levels of consumption in Europe and North America, followed by Latin America, Asia Pacific, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. But the triangles represent the rate of increase, how much the increase will be over that period, percentage change between 2010 and 2021. And what you can see from this is that in terms of percentage increase, the largest increase will come from the Asian countries and the Asia Pacific, which have both the income to buy the dairy products, they have the willingness to change their diet, and there's a lot of attention, as we saw in one of the earlier pictures, of school feeding programs and the like, which are orientated towards milk and milk products. The lowest area of consumption would remain Africa, and we don't see any substantial growth in that area. As I said at the beginning, Asia and Africa are the two areas where population is expected to increase. So I'd just like to finish there because I think I've met my time and maybe gone over it. And I'd like to remind everybody that hasn't done so to think about celebrating World Milk Day, if not on Sunday, perhaps next year. Thank you very much.